students who are registered to sign in. And just as a reminder, I checked your deadline for your reflective journal or paper or whatever you decide to do to fulfill the requirements of this class is due on Tuesday the 18th. So that's Tuesday during finals week. And I'm also going to send around, I did this last time, but for those of you who weren't here, we are hopefully going to be able to offer a bicycle pedestrian planning class in the fall taught by me and Birk, contingent upon budget, which all of you know in Oregon these days is a big if. And it's unclear to us what our budget in the fall is going to be. So, but what I do want to do is at least start a list of names of people who are interested. So if we are able to offer it, we can notify you. And for those of you who don't know, you can take classes at PSU even if you're not enrolled as a degree program student at PSU. So people from the community can take our classes. My last reminder is when you ask questions, remember to use the microphone, which is at roughly each table, and push on the where it says touch and keep holding it down with the red light on as you're speaking, and that way our friends out in Webland can hear your questions both live and when it's archived. And we do actually have people out there watching us live and archived, so it's good that they can hear all the questions in addition to the answers. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mia Birk, who's currently a principal at Alta Consulting, doing all sorts of bicycle and pedestrian work. Previously, she's been the bicycle coordinator. Is that the right title for City of Portland?
Close enough.
Close enough. And I'm going to turn it over to her.
And somebody warned me when we're getting close to the end of time, and I'll try to wrap it up. Yes?
How long did you say you were in Portland?
I'm in Portland. I mean, I live in Portland. But at the City of Portland?
Yeah.
I was there. I was at the City of Portland from 1993 to 1999, 6 years. There is a current bicycle program coordinator at the City of Portland. His name is Roger Geller. So they still have somebody there that's doing some stuff. So if you're looking for a job, that would, you know. And everybody here like to ride bicycles? Everybody own a bicycle? Ride? Who's a dedicated, nonstop, rides every day bike commuter, no matter what the weather? Okay, and how fair weather cyclists? A few here? Okay, that's fine. And I should tell you, for credibility's sake, that for most of the last 10 years, bicycling was the only way I got around. And now that I have two small children, I have sort of a more balanced approach to things, where I take the bus and walk and share a car with my husband, and also ride my bicycle frequently with kids. So kind of a little bit more of a multimodal commuter now. Trip chaining, heard these terms. Okay, let me get started. How'd we get there? Here's what I'm going to cover. Basically sort of the history and the main components of how we got to where we are today, the growth in the bikeway network and some technicalities about how we actually implemented all these various bikeways in a relatively short period of time, how the City of Portland has worked to institutionalize bicycle planning and bicycle design throughout the departments, how we worked on that, and then the results. What has this resulted in? Okay, let me start with the history. Back in the 70s, the very early 70s, when we had the first energy crisis, Oregon was one of the first states to react, and they said, okay, well, let's do something about this and make it more friendly to bicycle and walk. And they passed the first and still only statewide bicycle bill that has the following language: that bicycle, it's actually, this isn't the actual wording because the wording is somewhat dated, but the gist of it is that bicycle and pedestrian facilities should be included in all transportation projects and shall be a part of new construction and major roadway reconstruction, and that there should be a minimum 1% transportation funding on bicycle and pedestrian expenditures in the state of Oregon, on bicycle and pedestrian projects in the state of Oregon. That's still the only state that has that language. It is a floor, not a ceiling. It's a minimum 1% expenditure, and that could be a part of a roadway project or something like that, or it's not very precise as to how that 1% gets spent. That led to Portland. The City of Portland first had a bicycle task force in 1973 and developed one of the country's first bicycle master plans back in 1973, and it's a pretty good document. And that led to the creation of the task force. Eventually became the Bicycle Advisory Committee, and those folks are still meeting today, still meeting monthly today. And these folks are still meeting today. These specific folks have been on the committee for a long time. The various other things that happened in the 70s here in Oregon also really had a big benefit on bicycles in 70s and 80s. Turning the Front Street, Harbor Drive highway into Waterfront Park, things like that. In putting transit in various places in Portland has really helped because it's gotten, transit is good for bikes because more people are in transit and less people are on the road driving, which makes it easier to bike. The various types of land use planning activities have helped for specifically really in the east side of Portland, the compact development in the east side and Central City and Northwest Portland and other areas, having connected streets, having compact development, all those things have really helped to make bicycling an option. If you look at the suburban places around the outskirts of Portland, there are bike facilities on a lot of streets. There are bike lanes, but it's not nearly as easy to bike. The land uses are much more spread out. The traffic is horrible. It's very intimidating for people to bike, particularly because the distances are quite far to get from where you are to where you're going, whereas Portland is much more compact and dense, and that definitely helps. And as I said, transit has helped as well. Now let me go back to the history. In the early 70s and 80s, there were very few projects happening. There was a lot of enthusiasm, but not that much happened. There was some signing on some streets that said bike route. There were some bike racks that went in a few places. There were some events that happened, some bike commute days, and there was various other events that happened. And that was about it. There were a few projects that came out of the early bike master plan that went in, bike lanes on 26th Avenue on the way to Reed College, if you've seen that. Very difficult projects, and some bike signing on some local streets. But then we had the 80s, and the support totally eroded at this point in the 80s. There was very little political support, and the few projects that were out in the public that actually got talked about. There's one on Northeast Knott Street, K-N-O-T-T, anybody that knows that project. It's a 36-foot wide street with parking on both sides and one travel lane in each direction, and to get bike lanes into a street like that, you have to remove parking. Parking is very lightly used on that street, but yet it was just a horrible battle. It was just a very pitched battle, and it eventually was voted down at City Council, which had very little support at the time, and it threw the city's bike program into a tailspin, and it took them a long time to recover from that. And there was just a lot of resistance. It just wasn't seen as a very popular thing. Then in the late 80s, early 90s, a couple of things happened. There was increasing political support. Congressman now, Commissioner Earl Blumenauer took over at the City Council as the Bureau head for transportation, and he's very supportive of bicycle issues. The Hawthorne Bridge was closed, and this led to the organization of a lobbying group, a bicycle activist group called the Bicycle Transportation Alliance, which is very active today. And they went into high gear to try to get TriMet to accommodate bicycles during the closure and to allow bicycles to go across the bridge during the closure. And that really helped a lot. And probably the most significant thing that happened was ICE-T was passed. And y'all have heard about ICE-T, right? Every single person in this room knows what ICE-T stands for, has heard about ICE-T. So all of a sudden, there was money. And that is just you cannot underestimate what a difference that made to have the federal government say that transportation dollars that are coming to your region can, in fact, be spent on bicycle and pedestrian projects, and that there's going to be certain pots of money that are really dedicated to these types of projects. That really energized the city of Portland to start doing something. It energized the activists, and in 1993, when I came to Portland, Earl Blumenauer and the Bicycle Transportation Alliance and the Bicycle Advisory Committee all were basically looking to shake things up and really get things moving. So that's what we did. So back in 1973, the bikeway network looked like this. Basically, there were sidewalks on bridges, so not very much. In 83, there was some shoulders on St. Helens Road and Marine Drive, and that was about it for shoulders on some urban, some sort of rural type roadways, and then there were a path along the Waterfront Park path and the path that goes on Leif Erikson Drive through Forest Park. So in 1993, we had about 65 miles of bikeways. We had added the I-205 bike path, or the state had added that as part of the highway construction project, and a few more shoulders. And let me tell you what the lines are. The purple lines are off-street paths that are separated from the roadway. The blue lines are marked on-street bicycle lanes on the roadway, and the green lines are what we call bicycle boulevards, or local streets, quiet streets in neighborhoods where there's been something to make those streets work well for bicycles. And I'll explain that in a little more detail, how we get to those, what we call a bicycle boulevard. So that was 1993. Then by 1996, we'd added a few more. I'm just going to go quickly through this so you can see that by the year 2003, we have about, I believe it's up to 260 miles of bikeways now. So it went pretty darn fast in the 90s. That's a pretty significant expansion, basically more than, let's see, that's more than quadrupling, right? That's my math. Yeah, more than quadrupling the number of bikeways in a 10-year period. And then once the entire bikeway network is built out, it's going to be extremely dense. And everything's going to be finished. It's going to be perfect. Well, obviously, it's not likely that we're going to get to the preferred complete bikeway network, but it's pretty darn good already, so that's okay. So if you look at the bikeway development over time, again, the green is the bike boulevards, and the purple is the paths, and the blue is the bike lanes. You can see the growth in the bikeway network over time, and then this is looking at it, if you look at it cumulative over the years. 27, is just the number of miles. Okay. Yes. Go ahead. Ask questions during. I didn't.
And so shared. Do the microphone.
Oh gosh.
So
Speak into the
do
microphone.
shared roadway fall into any of those categories where bikes share the road, or is it just strictly where there's bike lanes?
The green lines. The green lines are what we in Portland call, they are a form of sign-shared roadways. The AASHTO guidebook calls them sign-shared roadways. The green lines, we call them in Portland Bike Boulevard. And it's not just a roadway that you can bike on, because you can bike on any roadway, but something's been done. There's been signing or traffic calming or intersection improvements or other things that have made this street a preferred route for bicyclists to use. So there are some. Most of those are on relatively quiet streets.
Are those the same ones that are the green lines in the Metro's bike there map, the low traffic through streets? Are those all considered boulevards, or?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. Other questions? Okay. Go back to where I was. Whoops. Oh.
That'll be my last.
Okay, sorry. I got flustered. Okay, back in 1993, we went out to the public when I first started, and we initiated a bicycle master plan process. And one of the first things we did was really ask the public what works well about bicycling now, and what are the real problems? What should we focus on? And there was an overwhelming chorus that bridges, you have to get the bridges right, that bridges are a huge barrier, that people felt like the bridges were such a disconnecting thing for being able to bike into and out of downtown and through the neighborhoods, and particularly the Willamette River bridges leading into downtown. There's 5 the Hawthorne, Broadway, Burnside, Steele, and Morrison bridges in downtown. Then there's also the Selwood Bridge in Selwood neighborhood and to the south, the Ross Island Bridge, the St. John's Bridge, and I'm not counting the two freeway bridges, the Markham and what do we call the other one? Fremont Bridge. So the main bridges were really all fairly poor quality for bicycling and walking, and particularly for disabled access at the time. And Hawthorne had extremely narrow sidewalks, and the approaches getting to the bridges were all really crummy as well. So we got one of the first iced tea grants in Oregon went for the Enhancements Fund, went to, maybe it was a CMAQ, I can't remember, but it was focused on studying the bridges from a bicycle, pedestrian, and accessibility standpoint and coming up with action plans for improving the bridges. So, and that has been, at this point, there have been improvements made to, significant improvements to Hawthorne, Broadway, Burnside, and Steele, and Morrison Bridge is under design now to improve that one, and there's been almost nothing done on the Selwood, St. John's, or Ross Island bridges. So let me show you a few examples of what's been done so far. The Hawthorne Bridge is probably the most interesting in that there were a lot of changes made over about an 8-year period. A lot of minor changes. Let me show you what it looked like before. This is the aerial view from downtown if you're standing on a garage roof. So before there was a ramp coming from Nadeau Parkway, so there was one ramp. Bicyclists are coming from downtown, and there wasn't even a bike lane there. This is already, there's been a bike lane added, but previously there was you would come up here and there's one level of conflict here. And then there was another conflict here, and I've got a more detailed photo of that. There was very narrow sidewalks. They were about a little bit less than 6 feet wide, which is pretty narrow. There were no, and as you came off the bridge coming really down on this side and on the other side, there were no bike lanes of any kind. And it was, there were a lot of conflicts and a lot of concerns, and it was really felt like it was a barrier. Now, over time, we first of all, not in this exact order, but this ramp was closed, and this was improved, and I'll tell you how. The sidewalks, a very major project, was almost doubling the width of the sidewalks, and adding bike lanes to the approaches.
So you push the sidewalks out?
The sidewalks were cantilevered out. That's right. At the same time as the deck was replaced on the bridge for motor vehicles, and the bridge was repainted this beautiful color. You may disagree with that. Okay. The before and after, this is probably, I think, the most significant change. Before, bicyclists would come up to this point and are supposed to yield to cars here, and then are supposed to yield to pedestrians on the sidewalk as they make basically a completely abrupt 90-degree turn to get onto the sidewalk, this extremely narrow sidewalk. It was really hairy. There were lots of near misses. It was really bizarre and unclear and just constant problems. Does anybody remember that? Anybody was here back then? Okay, so then today, I mean, this is a pretty significant improvement, I think, with really relatively minor changes, is that, first of all, the pedestrian crossing is here by itself. So there's a separate pedestrian crossing, which helps. So pedestrians are down here. Bicyclists come up here, and cars have to stop. So it's very clear as to who is responsible for yielding. The sidewalk's been widened significantly, and so the whole thing has been changed to really orient towards the pedestrian and the bicycle. Todd Boulanger, City of Vancouver, yes.
Yeah, as a pedestrian, the cars don't stop for me there. I mean, I love it as a bicyclist, but I think the drivers maybe, I don't know, need a double stop.
A double stop? I thought they have a double stop.
I think it's yield for drivers at the pedestrian crossing. Okay,
we're going to get that comment to the appropriate person at the city, since I don't work there anymore. Okay, then over on the east side, and I think that one of the reasons why this bridge works really well is because all the approaches have bike lanes, because you've got, as you come up on all sides and as you're getting off on all sides, you have something to lead you there, and there's bike lanes on all the various approaches, and that has helped a lot as well. So that's the Hawthorne Bridge. The Steele Bridge, the Burnside Bridge, we added bike lanes by taking out a lane, and that was one of the first projects that happened. Then on the Broadway Bridge, the surface of the sidewalks was very slippery. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but we resurfaced the sidewalks. And again, bike lanes on all the approaches, and there's a somewhat improved bike signal at the Lovejoy ramp. The Steele Bridge is the most incredibly radical change, because there used to be, and there still is, of course, on the upper deck, this very, very, very narrow, like 4-foot wide sidewalk with guardrail, and only really functional on one side, on the south side. There was many, many years where it was signed bikes were supposed to walk bikes on, and they never, and bicyclists didn't, so they actually took the sign down, and now they have a sign that says bicyclists on roadway, but it's still really just not a very pleasant situation. But now on the lower deck, there is, again, a cantilevered walkway, bikeway, that is a 10-foot wide shared use path connecting the two sides of the river together. The only downside of this being, as anybody's probably experienced as they've tried to go over this, is that it's in the raised position a fair amount of the time because of the river traffic. So all in all, the changes on these 4 bridges have been very dramatic, and this is showing the number of bicyclists on these 4 bridges over time. Portland does count bicyclists every year, has a team, actually a PSU class now that goes out every summer and counts bicyclists at the same locations all around downtown and the central city. I don't know if any of you have participated in Joe Mazur's class, but that's one of the projects that they do every summer. And that way, and previous to that, we always had interns counting things. We have counts going all the way back to the 70s in a lot of locations. And so we can really gauge over time how much bike use is going up, and we can compare that to population and motor vehicle growth and other things. A lot of cities don't do that. Portland's has really focused on that, and I think that's helped a lot. So as you can see, bike use on these bridges has gone up just dramatically. The Hawthorne Bridge is shown on the bottom, and there's these numbers are a couple years old, so there's, I think, over 4,000 cyclists on the Hawthorne Bridge today. The most significant jump is the top one, the Steel Bridge, where you went from a few hundred cyclists per day, tripling that in 1 year, obviously because of the improvements on the Steel Bridge, so that's good. Mm-hmm.
Why isn't the I-5 bridge over the Columbia on this list?
Well, it wasn't part of the initial bridge projects, and we do have numbers on the I-5 bridge. As you know, it's relatively small numbers compared to these, but they weren't part of this initial set of projects because it wasn't nearly as considered as high of a priority at that time. Yeah.
One last thing. On the Steel Bridge, with the deck, the path very much lower, is it safe to assume that it's much quieter to cycle on that from a traffic noise perspective?
It is. I think it's quieter. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Quieter?
And except there's trains.
Except for the trains, which kind of rumble by, right?
That's great.
Which is, yeah, okay. Todd?
Do you want to speak regarding the relationship with the city and the railroad? I
am going to. The design of the Steel Bridge, I'm going to get to that. I could give you a whole lecture on rail with trail issues, which are like issues of designing trails next to active next to active railways, because I did a whole national study on that we just completed. It's just being published. So Jennifer's going to have to invite me back to talk about that, because railroad issues are completely and utterly fascinating, and it's a whole nother, it's an hour at least. Okay, let me go on.
Yes.
Anybody else? Yes, John?
I assume that was that number of trips, not number of cycles. Is that right?
This is it's the number of cyclists. I mean, people literally counting. Oh, no, I'm sorry, you're right. This is the number of daily trips. And the way that they derive that, okay, we sat there and we count for 2-hour period, which is the peak period, and then multiply that times 5. It's considered 1/5 of the daily traffic. That's how they do motor vehicle projections. So in order to calibrate that and verify that that was accurate, at least once a year, when I was there, we also did 24-hour video counts, and we counted all the cyclists in that 24-hour period and compared it to the 2-hour count and to the projection, and that we felt very confident that that was very close to being accurate in terms of a daily projection. Okay. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Okay, so is that clear? So this would be a 24-hour count. Okay. So Portland's added a whole lot of on-street bicycle lanes as well. After the bridge improvements, what the community said that they really wanted to see more than anything else was a network of on-street bicycle lanes. On-street bicycle lanes, knowing that they would primarily be on higher volume streets that are above 3,000 cars per day. And what people basically said over and over again is that those are the streets that they use. That's where that gets them to where they want to go as fast as they want to go. And these aren't, of course, the best streets for people with small children or for people who maybe are just getting started cycling, but that this is very important for visibility and other things. So over time, the city of Portland has added, I think, has about 150 miles of on-street bicycle lanes. There are several different ways that Portland has gone about getting bicycle lanes. Remember, Portland is a built urban environment. Lots of places, when you're building a brand new place, you can add bicycle lanes whenever you build the road. Like in Vancouver, where these two guys work. Although even there, you sometimes fight about how much you're going to widen the road, and gosh, you don't have enough room to widen it and have bike lanes, so you cut out the bike lanes, right? No, we don't. It's a whole other story. But in Portland, we're mostly dealing with a built urban roadway system, so we had to go back and figure out how to retrofit these roadways to be able to accommodate bike lanes. And there's where it starts to get tough and controversial in some places. In a lot of places, we found that we could narrow the lanes without removing anything, just narrow everything up a foot. And this is one example. There were a lot. It turned out we actually, the engineers that I worked with at the City of Portland when we first got there, we analyzed almost all of the major roadways in Portland. We measured and we went out and calculated how much we could decrease the footage. And the engineers were shocked because they really thought that that there was no way that you could accommodate bike lanes without taking something away, that everyone was going to be about it. Well, we turned out that there were a lot of streets that you could just squeeze everything a little bit, still maintain a 10 or 11 foot traffic lane for motor vehicles, and which is safe enough. The engineers feel comfortable with that. And we could accommodate bike lanes. So this is one example on the east end of the Broadway Bridge near the Blazer Arena here, where it used to look like this, and then we basically just narrowed everything up and added a bike lane. And there's a lot of streets like that. A lot of the more suburban roadways in Portland and outer East Portland and North Portland, pretty wide lanes that you could squeeze everything up. Yes?
On that last picture, it looks like you eliminated parking.
No.
That's a lane. Those people look awfully close to the curb.
Oh, where the bus is?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think that's parking. I don't think so. I think there ever was parking there. No.
And you added the ramp.
We added this ramp here. Before, bicyclists were kind of jumping off the sidewalk here, and it was pretty yucky. And we added the ramp here, and actually also probably some of you are aware there's a blue area here. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Yeah, we expanded the sidewalk a little bit so that there would be a more obvious and better transition getting down there. You don't see as much bicycle use on Southeast Division, Southeast 122nd, streets like this, even though there are bike lanes. And they're there, and they're very low cost to get them in. You simply just don't see as much bicycle use. But you do see some, and it's definitely been increasing. And, we have a different population there. You don't have as much of the bicycle commuters in Lycra that are trying really hard to get where they want to go fast. You have much more of the resident populations that are simply trying to get around within the neighborhood, and a lot more kids and other folks that I think the bike lanes there are an improvement from a safety standpoint. Then we did a bunch of streets where we took something away. Something has to go. If you can't just narrow everything up, then something has to give. And you can either take away travel lanes or you can take away parking if there's on-street parking. And those are really your two options. So in some cases, we found that there is really enough room to have. There's enough space to have pretty functional street with, instead of having 4 lanes, like this is Northeast Gleason. And Northeast Gleason in the neighborhood of the 24th to 39th. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that area, but this street, even today, my office is right by here. And today, we took away a lane, and now it's 1 lane in each direction with a center turn lane. The neighborhood wanted this. They came to us and they said, this is a really big feeling street. And we want it to feel like not quite such a big street, because there's just not that much traffic. And even today, there's just not that much traffic on this street. And the same thing was the case on, we did the same sort of thing called a road diet, kind of tighten your belt, on North Denver and Southeast 7th in the Central East Side. And they all worked pretty darn well. They were all streets that had a lot of turning movements. So having that center turn lane just really has taken a lot of the traffic that was blocking the 2 inner lanes and compressed them into the 1 lane. Southeast 7th, the engineers went back and really looked carefully at the history of accidents, crashes on that street, and there had been a lot, and they found a really dramatic improvement in the number of crashes by reorganizing the geometry of the street with the lines. And this, obviously, you can't do this on every street, but it has worked, and a lot of cities are doing this kind of stuff now. Questions on this? Yes?
So are the streets that you're showing us ones that the neighbors specifically asked you to look at, or did you just do an inventory of all the streets?
We had a bike master plan process. We went through very carefully and looked at a whole variety of streets. We had a ton of public meetings. It was a 3-year process. We met individually with neighborhood groups and business groups and in some cases residents. And then that was adopted in 1996, and then we went back and had individual projects in some cases. In some cases, the maintenance bureau, like that one I showed you, Southeast Division, that's way out there. really didn't have any specifically focused meetings on this. The Maintenance Bureau was doing an overlay, a maintenance repaving, and as part of that, they put the bike lanes in because they weren't taking anything away. In this case, the neighborhood came to us. In the other cases, the North Portland one, we had gone through a very extensive process just on the North Portland streets. And on Southeast 7th, it's kind of a funny story. I had just started working very closely with the Maintenance Bureau and trying to train them on what to look for and work with us, not against us, and I had gone out with the sweeping crew in the middle of the night, and I had shown them how if you sweep, how they weren't really sweeping up the glass for bicyclists, and we brought bicycles out with them, and we brought them donuts, and we were trying really hard to get the Maintenance Bureau to kind of be on our side, and they somewhere along the way got the message, and they called me up. They have this annual list of all the streets they're going to just overlay with the asphalt. And so in theory, we were going to be able to put, you want to put the bike lanes in if you're going to do bike lanes at that same time rather than having to come back later. That's more inefficient. So on Southeast 7th, in the Central East Side, on a Saturday morning, I got a call from the head of the striping crew. And he said, I'm out here on Southeast 7th, and it looks to me like this is on your bicycle master plan. Do you want me to stripe bike lanes on this street? And we had not really done like a specific, we had done a Central City plan and a Central City bike plan, but we hadn't really worked individually with those property owners for a pretty major change like that. It would have been going to this treatment, but we decided to go ahead and do it, and so I called up the engineer. We basically went out there and restriped it over a weekend to look like this. And then on Monday morning, well, the businesses were not happy. They were not happy at all. And we got, we went out retroactively and, went door to door and apologized and sat down and explained what had happened and asked what the problems were. And we got quite a few comments, and mostly they were about things like, well, we've got a problem because these trucks park in front of my store and you didn't address that. They still are parking. Or this intersection stinks and you didn't address that. Well, you came in here and you put these damn bike lanes in, but you didn't address the real problems that we have. So kind of as a result of opening that door, we went and fixed like all those individual problems. And they didn't have really that much problem with the bike lanes, and they worked, and it was fine. But it was kind of it wasn't the best way, the most friendly way, I guess, the most sort of the Portland way where you really talk everything to death before you make a decision. It wasn't that, but it wasn't in a way efficient because we went out and did it. And so I don't know. You can kind of argue whether it's better to ask for permission or ask for forgiveness. John?
Assuming you're going to ask for permission related to projects related to overlay, did you do projects where you saw an upcoming overlay and you knew the striping route and you did public involvement prior to that overlay? Yeah. There
were quite a few projects where the project was on an overlay list, and we asked the Maintenance Bureau to delay it for a year so that we could do public process. And so then it came, when it came back up, we tried to do it on a coordinated approach. Yeah, and it took us a while to kind of get to the relationship where we were working together in that way. Yeah.
Mia, could you also speak to the previous slide where you had Division Street, I think?
Yep.
The suburban environment where you might not have the bicycle volumes.
Right.
But I assume you've studied maybe a better environment for parking and, that buffer area. Better for peds, better for parkers.
Did we study it?
Yeah.
Well, we don't have any specific studies, but that was the feeling that that you could improve a bunch of things. We did study the fact that on a lot of these streets, this one and Gleason and a handful of other ones, that by providing that extra stripe, by tightening everything up, that it reduced the overall traffic speeds 3 to 4 miles an hour on average on the streets. And the engineers felt like that was an improvement because it got people to get closer to the speed limit without having to put in speed bumps or increase enforcement. It's a very cheap way if you just put a stripe. So there was that improvement. And then, we felt that there was an improvement to the pedestrian environment by pushing the moving vehicles further away and by creating that buffer. And then it was also felt that it was more efficiently using the street too from a maintenance perspective, because then it spread out the load differently than it had been spread out over the previous generations. By moving the stripes around, then you move where the cars are traveling, which extends the lifetime of the road by at least another 20 years or something. So there was that feeling. So there were numerous benefits that can be derived that go just beyond just providing the space for bicycles. Okay, the third one I just want to touch on briefly is restricting parking or providing bike lanes instead of parking. So this is Southeast Madison, and there are quite a few streets where, sure, it's a trade-off. You can have bike lanes or you can have parking. That's the reality. You just can't have both. And what we did was, these were always controversial, so we went very carefully with any of these streets. And this one, we really worked hard with the Central East Side neighborhood on this. And it's only in the cases where, in Portland, it's been only in cases where there was, a really critical connection that, and the parking could really easily be accommodated in other places. I mean, every city gets into this debate. Is the street right-of-way best used for parking vehicles or for moving vehicles or for moving vehicles and people? What's the best use of the right-of-way? And there's no clear-cut policy decision that says this comes first and this comes second and this comes third. There never is. It really comes down to a debate individually on specific streets. In Southeast Madison, I feel absolutely confident this is a much better use of the space. We've got a huge volume of cyclists trying to get to the Hawthorne Bridge. There's a ton of off-street parking in this area. There's plenty of on-street parking. So I think this is absolutely a good decision. And in most of the cases, I think most of the cases the decisions were right. There's maybe one that I felt like I could have gone with the neighbors and left the parking there. And there's some other ones where we left there's a couple where, darn it, I fought hard and we left the parking on and not the bike lanes. And it wasn't my decision, and it still makes me mad. So that's the reality. With parking, obviously there's an issue of got to keep the space clear. You've got to enforce the parking. And I think Portland's pretty good. In New York City, there'd be 100 cars parked in this space. In lots of other places, double parked, triple parked, right? And it just doesn't work in a lot of places because of the parking issues. Okay, let me touch on bike boulevards, because once the city of Portland started working on the bridges and put a lot of on-street bike lanes on the easy streets, and then also worked on the off-street path network, there came a point kind of towards the end of, kind of when I left, where it looked like we had kind of run out of those easy projects and those relatively easy projects, and that it was going to be pretty hard to put bike lanes on the rest of the streets because it was going to be a battle on parking or travel lanes or something. It just wasn't going to work easily. So then we turned in a lot of ways to what other streets can we use that can work well. There had been a history in Portland of putting up little bike route signs on quiet streets, and people weren't using them. It wasn't a cohesive system. They didn't really make sense. You would be on a quiet street, and then you'd get to a major street like 39th or 82nd, and you have to cross this incredibly major street from this quiet street with no protection whatsoever. There had been no thought to how do these streets work, and then also they weren't getting you where you needed to go. So there was just, the cycling community at the time was just, really couldn't stand the way we had done our local traffic streets in terms of integrating those into the network. So we worked hard to make it streets that would work well, that ran directly parallel to a major street, provided a good alternative, did get you where you wanted to go, and that the streets worked really well and were cohesive with the rest of the network. The signing thing is still going on, and the city, we got a grant like in 1998 that they still haven't implemented. They're working on it. They say next winter that's going to have a more comprehensive signing system so you could get around, you could really know where these streets were. But a couple of the things that we did, one is to make these streets work, try to get motor vehicle traffic off the streets and make them much more into a priority bicycle or pedestrian street by diverting traffic off of those streets at 39th and Clinton and Lincoln, and at 20th and Lincoln. And Lincoln Street and Clinton Street and Salmon Street were kind of all done at the same time. There was a project to try to get the traffic out of the neighborhoods and onto Hawthorne, Division, and Powell and Belmont. And so there was this effort to make these local streets that were being used as these cut-through streets much more of a neighborhood street. But the neighbors fought them so hard. They didn't want to divert traffic. They were afraid. How are they going to get to their houses? It's going to erode property values. It's going to increase crime. I mean, they had all these concerns. And now if anybody would bike on these streets, I suggest you do. Go to Lincoln Street or Clinton Street. They are extremely popular streets for bicycling and walking. Neighbors love them. It's a very desirable place to live, and it works great. But it is very hard to do traffic diversion projects, and the city of Portland has pretty much abandoned them because it was just, not just these projects, but every other one since then has just been very difficult. Takes a long time, and it's just, with minimal budget, the city of Portland decided that these weren't worth doing. So, but those worked well. Traffic calming, things like slowing the traffic down on these streets. At the time, also, Portland did a lot of little mini traffic circles in neighborhoods, which have questionable quality for bicycles, whether you get squeezed when you go around them. I personally like them. I think they're nice, but I'm a confident cyclist. I like the fact that there's landscaping in the middle. It's pretty, very pretty for the street, but they're very expensive. Speed bumps are really cheap and are much more effective at actually slowing traffic down than the circles are. So the city of Portland has a very minimal traffic calming program now that does a few speed bumps. We really focused on crossing enhancements on these lower volume streets. 16th crossing Belmont, shortening the crossing distance by putting in curb extensions. So whereas had to cross 36 feet, and you only have to cross 20 feet. At the corner, at the intersection of Ankeny, 11th, and Sandy, this isn't even exactly what it looks like now. Wait a second. Well, I thought I had a before picture. But there used to be nothing there. It was just this sea of asphalt with all these turning movements, lots of crashes, very uncomfortable. And we have this bike boulevard on Ankeny that runs directly parallel to Burnside. Very nice bike boulevard that you can bike on, but crossing the intersection was really awful. So we added medians. There's trees in them now. Changed the traffic around, tightened everything up. It was a fairly contentious project, but a good one. A good result, I think. Okay. We also focused on intersection safety, and Portland has this famous blue bike lane program. In a lot of European cities, they use colored treatments to mark the bike lanes, mark the paths, and particularly mark the intersections. We felt right off the bat that we can't afford to. No American city can afford to go around and put red on every bike lane, or except for maybe Vancouver, right? Soon.
It's not about affording. It's about doing it.
Well, there's a feeling that it's not that using this that using color in appropriate places was a good idea in order to try to study, would this improve the safety at intersections? There still is. You get to intersections, there's a conflict there. Typically, in most cities, you drop the bike lane when you get to intersections, and bicycles are supposed to basically act like a car, get in the travel lane and act like a car, be aggressive. And what you see out there is that it just intimidates people, and the city of Portland wants to encourage people to bike. So just dropping the bike lane wasn't a good idea. Just having the bike lane go up to the intersection, that's a little bit better. But what do you do at these conflict areas? We got a grant, and we worked closely with the community. I did about 30 community meetings. We worked with the community on what's the right color to use. We worked with the community. We studied all the literature that's out there. We worked with the community on what sites we should use, where are the problems, what can we do to address them. We did a very rigorous before and after testing of the pavement, of the color, to see if it made a difference or not, see if there were any safety problems, see what results we had. So Portland did 10 intersections like this where there were conflict areas, and basically colored the conflict area blue. And there were areas where the bicyclist has the right-of-way, the bicyclist is going straight through, and the motorist is turning across the bicycle lane, either to exit a roadway, enter a right turn lane. So there's some interaction between motorists and bicyclists where motorists are supposed to yield. There's another example on the Hawthorne Bridge. This has been a very effective one. That's the movements. So there were a lot of findings, and you can look at this study on the City of Portland's website. If you find the bicycle section, it's up there. And most significant improvement was that in terms of yielding, that the motorist yielding went up significantly as a result. Motorists either stopped or yielded, a statistically significant difference in motorists yielding to cyclists. The City of Portland also focused a lot on, Don.
How big a conflict would you go to that measure of actually putting the blue in, as opposed to the parallel stripes?
In the study, basically we had a limited budget, so we picked 10 sites where there were a relatively high volume of cyclists and a high volume, and we didn't have a history of crashes that we could look to at any of these sites. Really, it was after really working with the community, it was, where are you seeing problems? And we had either had a litany of complaints from motorists or cyclists at all those locations, and we also had a high volume of cyclists so that we could get a good sample at all those locations.
Well, if you were retrofitting a roadway without going through that public process, is there volume thresholds that you would recommend based on your experience and not necessarily the study?
I think, I don't think that it makes sense to do it for every single right turn lane that looks like this. That's just, we have lots of places where motorists cross into, and what I find on this is that motorists don't tend to cross here. They tend to cross wherever it's free. It doesn't seem to work in terms of channelizing motorists to a specific spot on this. Very typical where you just pick up a right turn lane. But I do feel like where you have a ramp situation, and there were about half the study was about ramps, where motorists were really exiting or entering, and that they tend to not be looking where they need to be looking. And I think that it depends. I think this works, that if the geometry of it suggests that motorists aren't looking at the cyclists and the cyclists are in the way that they're interacting, that it's an appropriate use. And I do have some, not off the top of my head, but I have been working on this for San Francisco, is at what threshold of numbers do we get where we think it's worth it? And I do have some numbers. I can share that with you separately. That's a good question. And some cities are now using blue, but like everybody's debating, is blue, it conflicts with handicap ramp color, and gosh, you should use red, or you should use yellow, or you should use green, and there's no resolution on it. I'm not going to spend much time on bike parking, but that's a whole nother lecture, if you want to invite me back. There's a lot to discuss on bike parking, and it seems like a very simple issue, but it is actually a very complicated issue. The City of Portland has worked a lot on putting in bike parking. First of all, developers, when a new buildings go in, they're supposed to put their own bike parking in. It hasn't been a completely successful use of the code, but it is, that's a whole other thing. But it's, a lot of bike parking has gone in through private development. The City of Portland, at the time when we had more money, we had grant money available, we put in a lot of on-street bike racks in front of stores, and they were always at the request of stores. We had a little program. People would call up. I would like a bike rack in front of my store. It was a very nice service the city provided. You want a bike rack? Absolutely. We'd go out. We'd look at it. We'd see if we could fit it in, and we'd put the bike rack in. Fabulous. We put a lot of bike parking in city-owned garages. We worked very closely with the school district, and we got the rack manufacturers to donate racks, and we went to the school district, and we basically put racks in a whole bunch of schools. And it's really impressive because before there were basically 0 kids biking to those schools because there was no place for them to park their bike. And at most of these schools now, the bike racks are just jammed in the good weather, you know, and it's very impressive. Okay, shared use paths. The City of Portland has, the last few years is really where we're seeing, we're not seeing so much of the on-street bike lanes anymore because I said we did a lot of the easy projects. Instead, the city's been putting money mostly through the Parks Bureau into off-street paths. And the thing is with paths that's different from on-street bike lanes is it's kind of out of the traffic world, and it's way beyond just providing like a transportation facility for bicycles. It's about community meeting spaces and much more pedestrian and other kinds of uses, much more family-oriented, training ground for kids, much more about environmental education and outreach and community involvement and all these other things. It's just a really different kind of world in planning the off-street system as planning the on-street system. And they do intersect at a certain point where paths cross the roadway, and that is very critical. And there's, in fact, you know, you can destroy the value of a whole path by having a few crummy intersections, which I don't know if any of you have biked on the I-205 bike path. It's a pretty nice path. It works pretty well, but and the intersections, all but one, have been improved pretty significantly. But like Foster used to be just awful. It was just the worst. It was so dangerous, and there was a terrible fatality there. Same thing at Gleason, which hasn't been improved. And it, you know, really makes you question the value of the whole path if people are getting, you know, if it's really significantly not safe. And that's the problem where you have a path right next to a highway. At the time that the state built the highway, they intended to pay to have all the crossings go under or over the highway, but when it came time to pay for it, it was too expensive, so they made instead the path crosses ramps at various horrible locations, and it's questionable how well it works. But the other paths that the city's been working on are not nearly to that level because they're on abandoned railroad rights-of-way or along the waterfronts or in unused city rights-of-way. And there has been Springwater Corridor, the Waterfront Park, the Eastbank Esplanade, and the Peninsula Crossing Trail in North Portland and Marine Drive in North Portland and several other locations. And it's over 50 miles now of paths. The Springwater Eastbank Trail system, which has been the main focus of the City of Portland's money in the last 10 years, has been 30 miles of trail completed in a 10-year period, which is about average. I mean, trail projects take a long time. They take a long time, and there's lots of stuff. 2 parts were trail next to an active railway. There's one part that's the Springwater Corridor is converting the abandoned railway to a trail, and then there's parts along the river. The Springwater Corridor, this is the main part of it, goes from the Eastmoreland neighborhood out past Boring. It's incredibly popular, over 500,000 users. It goes annually. It goes through Gresham. It's got equestrian users. It's got urban parts, and it's got sort of rural parts and semi-industrial parts. And on a clear day, when you turn the corner at 136, this is what you see, and it's really very nice. One of the amazing things about the Springwater Corridor that is just so great is it really galvanized the neighborhood, particularly that area, the Lentz neighborhood where it goes through. It's a very poor neighborhood in Portland. It really is. And it has meant that the Boys and Girls Club's been involved, all the service clubs have been really involved. They've done Springwater Corridor plantings. They've done trainings for kids on the Springwater Corridor about bike safety. Some of the neighbors that fought it hard. I mean, fought it hard. This person right here absolutely did not want a path to go through their backyard. Well, they ended up putting in their own little sign and a little watering trough for friends and family. People that had fences along the way that to keep people out of their properties ended up, putting a gate in so that they could get out of their own property onto the trail. And it's very impressive. Then the other thing has been the economic impact. There's been developments along the way that call themselves the Springwater such and such, that advertise that they're on the Springwater Trail. There's been Springwater Grill and other businesses that have opened up, taken advantage of it. And in addition, there's fiber optic cable buried beneath the trail, which was basically the utilities paid for that. So it has helped financing. Yes.
Is there? You might not even know the answer to this, but is there like a higher rate of crime on those trails? I know growing up there was a trail that went through my neighborhood that was eventually completely removed because of the crime, and across the river in Vancouver, there's a trail that goes along the Columbia River from like Wentler Park to the waste sewer place, and I know like the kids all tore down all the lights and stuff so that they could go out there at nighttime and whatnot. So was there like just a crime increase in those on those paths?
To my knowledge, I don't know about these specific paths, but I do have a bibliography on our website that has links to a whole bunch of studies on issues of safety and issues of property values along paths. And for the most part, all the study, not all, but for the most part, the studies that I've seen have been quite positive. In fact, it's mostly had the opposite effect, that the trails go, like a good example is the Springwater-OMSI trail that just opened up. I mean, that was like homeless camps along the river, lots of dumping, very bad for the neighborhood. And that has been all cleaned up. And there's parts of this, too. I mean, I've heard anecdotal stories, more the opposite, that because now you've got a community presence. And on the Springwater Corridor, they have this telephone tree thing with the neighbors, Friends of the Springwater Corridor, where if one person sees something going on, particularly like they have a lot of dirt bike folks that are illegally on there, they call people down further along the way, and then by the time they get to the end, the police are there to intercept. So there's I've mostly seen positive stuff on that lately, and so I don't know about your specific situation. And I'm sure the city of Vancouver's replaced those lights by now, right? These guys work for the city of Vancouver, in case you didn't know. Okay, let me go on. The Springwater Corridor also has really state-of-the-art intersections, and I want to point that out because it crosses 82nd, 122nd, and Foster Road, all very major roadways, but the crossings were very nicely done. There's medians in the middle, there's push buttons, there's equestrian-sized push buttons. You can see, I can't quite see it. Well, there's three, yeah, can you see it? I can't see it at my angle. Look at this. Because they're tall, and they work really well, and I checked with the city recently, and they said they just haven't had any problems with those. Then we have the Eastbank, which is, people, there's been complaints in the community that Oregonians has had some negative editorials about the high costs. It's a very expensive trail project, very expensive. But, the city would say that it's not just a trail project. It's so much more than a trail project. It's really about revitalizing the whole east side. And I think this is the key. When the city decided a long time ago to put a freeway next to the river, instead of using that space for other things, they made a decision that has meant the economics of that area is what it is. And now it is revitalizing the east side. So I think that it's beneficial. But, there's others. I'm sure John Charles probably has a different opinion about whether that was valuable use of public dollars or not. The technicalities of it, it's very interesting. There's a floating portion of the walkway. Really, just about every design element you can imagine. How do you put a trail in a place where there is no room? There's a freeway next to it. You've got river issues. You've got regulatory issues. You can't believe how many regulatory agencies were involved. Army Corps of Engineers. There's fish issues. There's endangered species issues. There's water current issues, quality issues. There's bank stabilization issues, there's highway issues, ODOT was involved, the myriad of issues. So the fact that it was actually done in less than 10 years is kind of a miracle. The floating walkway is a fascinating, it's really expensive, but it's a really amazing 1,000 feet of very expensive trail. That's the reality. ADA compliance is an issue. Flooding is an issue. How do you have something floating on a river that periodically floods? Those of you who were here in 1996 knew this was basically when this was being built, and there was a lot of concern about how, so they ended up having to build the pylons, drive them even deeper down in, and the whole trail floats up and down on the pylons. And if you go stand on it, which you should do, and feel it, I mean, you can feel the walkway moving, and you can feel the pylon shaking with the current of the river. It's pretty amazing. Railroad issues, very big challenge to deal with the railroad. You have to get high above the railroad to clear the railroad. You have to deal with railroad liability issues. If you think that we're a very litigious country, railroads are very litigious, very concerned about liability. They don't want to ever be held blame. And they are. Unfortunately, railroads are frequently held for blame, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it. It's kind of there's a whole issue. It's a whole other story. But working with the railroad was a big deal. It took a long time to get railroad approval to both cantilever the walkway on the side of their bridge and also get over the railway on the other side. But eventually the city did that, and I think it's pretty cool. The Eastbank also worked hard. Part of some of the most costly elements were not really about the trail, but were about creating community meeting spaces, creating event spaces, creating spaces where you could then have a restaurant or some other kind of development activity on the east side blossom that you needed to have these meeting spaces. And these are all like cantilevered or built into stabilized banks, very expensive projects. And then there was a lot of public art and other kinds of things, connections from the east side built into it. Then there was also a lot of environmental restoration stuff that went on. The city is really focusing on river techniques. The Springwater-OMSI trail just opened, and it's really probably the only bicycle highway in the city of Portland. Maybe Marine Drive, but Marine Drive doesn't really get you where you want to go so much. But from the Selwood neighborhood to downtown Portland it is faster than it is by cars to go on bike. It's really cool. It's 3 miles. There is no street crossings. You pass through a wildlife refuge, pass through industrial areas. There was a lot of difficulty negotiating with the railroad. Although it's a very local railroad, the guys in Selwood neighborhood, very contentious, absolutely hates the city, has nothing good to say about the city, hates planners, hates everything to do with anything government related. But the city of Portland ended up paying him a lot of money to get it built. So money talks, and this is what it looked like before, and this is what it looks like today, and it's pretty cool. Okay, let me talk about. Yes, please.
I just want to make a comment about another off-road path that's on the RTP, the Regional Transportation Plan, because I was part of getting it on there, is the Banfield Corridor, or the Springwater Corridor Trail, which would go from where that bridge was, the steel bridge, out to the 205. And
yeah.
That's going to be the next bicycle highway. And what's exciting about that section is it'll create the first full loop.
It will. Yeah, that's a really good, that would be a really cool trail. I think technically it's going to be challenging.
Because you were saying this is a local train company.
Yeah.
Union Pacific, so it's a rails near trails,
yeah.
And so that's the big barrier.
Yeah.
But it's a great space, and I encourage everybody to look into it.
Yeah, everyone look into it. Have you picked your class project yet? Because that would be a good one to study.
No, I haven't, but I've done a lot of presentations on it just in my free time. It's basically where I-5 and I-84 meet, which is the steel bridge, convention center. The trail would go on the north slope of the Union Pacific tracks, on the just among the weeds there, from all the way along the Banfield to 205 and connect with 205 at Gateway.
Yeah, trail projects they take a long time. They're technically challenging. They have they cost a whole lot more than just putting in bike lanes. But the results are pretty significant. I mean, we could never have 1 million annual users on a bike lane on a street, but we will. I'm totally confident that we'll see that on the Springwater-OMSI within a couple of years. It's winter and it's packed, so it's going to be pretty cool. Yeah.
How do they weigh the cost? Because I was seeing your notes that one trail was 30 miles, but it cost $40 billion, so that's like a little more than $1 billion a mile. Like, how do they weigh the cost to how many bicyclists actually use it? Because you say 1 million a year compared to $40 billion.
Oh, it's 40 million. It's not billion. Did I say billion?
I thought it said.
Okay, there's no billions. Okay, but you're right. Trails frequently cost $1 million a mile or more. Sometimes less. if you already own the right-of-way and it's nice and flat. The Springwater Corridor, the bulk of it costs a whole lot less than that, but then the Eastbank costs more than that because of all those huge issues that you had to deal with on the river, and the railroad walkway itself was like $8 or $10 million. So there's, yes, trails can often be very expensive, and it's a public decision. You know, it's a public decision to weigh that. We can do a cost-benefit analysis, and you can't really compare it so much to highway improvements or other things because it's kind of like apples and oranges, but that's all part of when Metro, as the regional entity, is trying to work with all the regional partners to figure out how the region's going to spend its transportation dollars. That is part of what's factored in is what's the value of those spaces compared to the number of users. And but they don't have there's not one set way to measure that, and it really comes down to a community decision. Do you want to spend the money on this or not? And that's the reality. I used to say in the Portland Bike Master Plan, we estimated the entire cost of implementing the whole Bike Master Plan, including these trails, was $300 million over a 20-year period. And at the same time that I would say that, the Sylvan Interchange project at Highway 26 and Sylvan was going on. It was in many phases, and it was $300 million. So it's one interchange project versus an entire bikeway network. And that is a community decision. I mean, both those things were over time being funded, although Portland's never going to spend $300 million on the bike network. But that is, a decision that the community made, and it's a value decision. Okay. Portland Bike Master Plan, I'm not going to spend any time on that because I already talked about it, but it includes all the things. It's basically a blueprint for the future. What are all the things Portland's going to do? And it was adopted in 1996 and has had updates since then. I want to touch on transit improvements because it's kind of a cool story. In the early 90s, we had a bus network and we had MAX. We had one MAX line, and bikes were not allowed on MAX, and there were no bike racks on the buses. And almost every year since then, for about 10 years, TriMet has made some small improvement every year. First, they put racks on the buses. That was actually our first iced tea money that came to this region was for bike racks on buses. Then they allowed bikes on MAX, and between the racks on the buses and allowing bikes on MAX, you had to have a permit and go through a test and learn how to use the racks. And so that went on for a number of years. And then we petitioned when West Side MAX opened up, we petitioned TriMet to let us have an experimental period and we had peak hour restrictions. You couldn't take your bike on MAX during peak hour. So we tried to get an experimental phase to let us have bikes on during peak hour. And they did allow that, and then eventually after that they allowed bikes on all the time, and then they eventually eliminated the permits. And then now I think the best thing probably that we've seen in a long time is that when you take your bike on MAX, that there are hooks that you can hang your bike on, and that's just great because otherwise it's just so crowded on MAX. It's just so crowded all the time that I rarely take my bike on MAX because it's too crowded. I'd rather just bike it. So there's been a lot of improvements that have been made, and I have seen, and for a while TriMet was tracking this, and they were seeing pretty significant usage, particularly on some of the longer distance lines up through the hills and over to Sovies Island and into North Portland and Vancouver. I don't think they're tracking it anymore, but the observations, they do track complaints, and they've had very few complaints about bikes. And the observations have been that there's just very significant usage. Yes?
Actually, the complaint would probably be there's no room on the racks.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be the complaint. Well, I could see complaints when you're in MAX. If you're a pedestrian standing there and bikes get on, it's very crowded. I mean, it's very crowded. So I could see potential complaints there.
No, not that complaint, but on the bus. Usually the racks are full because they're being used.
Yeah, that's right. The bike parking code, as I said, there's bike parking going in various places. We've made improvements in working with the Maintenance Bureau. I think that what has happened in Portland that's really made a difference is not just that the city of Portland did a bunch of stuff, it's the community. And all that stuff in the community that's been going on has just been a part of the city of Portland. I mean, the city of Portland's probably a certain percentage of the work, but then the rest of it is there's all these other groups having community events, the Community Cycling Center working with kids in North Portland and other places, the Bicycle Transportation Alliance training, doing safety programs in schools and doing all kinds of outreach events. The bike shops, there's been a pretty impressive number of bike shops and bike-related economic activity in Portland. There's been all kinds of other bureaus that have seen that bicycling can provide a benefit. This is the Oregon Department of Transportation bicycling team, and this is the parking patrol. We've been working with getting parking patrol on bicycles and out of cars. It's just so much more cost-effective. PGE meter readers and other kinds of folks. I don't know if they're all going to use the little segways now or what, but it's a whole nother presentation. Okay, let's go to results. These numbers are a little bit old, but as I said, we've been tracking before and after numbers. And in some of these cases, it was before facility went in and after, and there's far more locations than I could include on one chart. But we saw a pretty significant increase in these, and the bridges are the most significant improvements over time. Yes?
Back to the institutional and the community stuff, do you think critical mass
the Yellow Bike program.
Has had a positive impact?
Well, my feeling has always been that bicycling, any news is good news, in the sense that I don't think critical mass is particularly great for bicycling, but it gets bicycling in the news. Like, the word bicycle is in the news more frequently as a result, and that is positive because it gets more people thinking about bicycling. Critical mass, we've seen an ebb and a flow every year since the early 90s. There's been kind of like, okay, a couple 30 or 40 people show up for a few rides, and it's all fine, and then a few bad people show up, and then there's a bunch of arrests, and then it's in the paper, and then 100 people show up, 200 people show up because it's in the paper, and then they fight with the police for a while, and we sit down and get a mediated thing, and then the police back off, and it goes, it just like keeps doing that. Yellow Bike program's the same sort of thing. Got a whole lot of publicity about Portland's innovative, great free Yellow Bike program. Have everybody heard about this? Gonna have free Yellow Bikes. It's a great, free spirit, socialist kind of concept, right? Put something free, people are going to use it and put it back. And it's been it's a disaster. It's been a disaster in every city. Every year or two, a bunch of volunteers get together, try to revitalize it. They fix a couple bikes. They put out 30 or 40 bikes. They get a big press release. The press puts something on it. A bike is found in Corvallis. There's more press on it. It's very exciting. And then it falls apart. So that's another one. We had a bike conference here in 1994. That was a big thing. There's going to be a pedestrian conference here in May. That's going to be a big thing for pedestrians, big national pedestrian conference. So generally, I think that all news is good news, for the bicycle world. That's my feeling. Bike use on the bridges. Interesting thing is that bike use on those three bridges, Burnside, Hawthorne, and Broadway, went up 78% in the 90s, whereas population went up 14%, and auto use only went up 8% on those bridges. So, it's numbers. Growth in the bikeway miles, growth in bikeway usage on the bridges. The blue line is growth in bridge bicycle traffic. I don't know why there was such a big dip that one year, sort of an anomaly. Overall, if you look at the 10-year trend, no, not really. No, not really so much that any bridge was closed. Because when the Hawthorne Bridge was closed, the Morrison Bridge was open and took all the traffic. And we just substitute those numbers when we use those. The bridge bicycle traffic, the line is the bridge bicycle traffic again. The little mailboxes, I don't know why it comes out that, are the number of crashes per year, and it's held steady at about 150 to 160 reported bike motor vehicle crashes per year. You're probably aware that we only can use the data that's available, and that actually you have to have a certain value of damage before things get recorded in the DMV statistics. So, mostly minor crashes, bike-only crashes, bike pedestrian crashes, none of that gets included. So in terms of major crashes that are reported, there's been about 150 to 160 a year, holding steady since about the late 80s. And that's pretty good. I mean, considering how much bike use has gone up. It's an overall declining crash rate. That's the crash rate. Looking and asking people, and again, this is the PSU class, but this was the survey from the year 2000. When did you begin to use your bicycle for work? Stopping people on the Hawthorne Bridge. About 2/3 just had been bicycling more than 2 years, but there was a pretty significant chunk, about 1/3, in the previous year to 2 years since the bulk of the improvements went in. And reported feelings of safety, the vast majority feeling pretty darn safe about bicycling in Portland. So that's the story of the bicycle network in Portland, and I think we have about 10 or 15 minutes if anybody has any more questions. Yes?
I'm active in the Brooklyn Neighborhood Association, and our main issue right now is that we're bound in, our boundaries are, though they include McLaughlin Boulevard, Powell, and the Ross Island Bridge, which are all under the jurisdiction of the state, which basically just ignores us when we bring up issues in terms of pedestrian improvements and bicycle use. What do you think is the best strategy for doing this? I mean, some of us have talked about campaigning to maybe get the city of Portland to take over jurisdiction on some of these streets. There has been some interest in doing that on McLaughlin, especially where the viaduct replacement is going to happen.
Right.
Both are very challenging ways of dealing with the problem, though. So just kind of curious in your reaction to that and where we're
I
at.
would try to work with the Bike Advisory Committee and the BTA and try to get that elevated to a higher priority. I think with the Springwater Corridor OMSI opening up, that you have a really good argument. The same thing is happening in the Hand neighborhood, just one to the north of you, north of Powell, because it's hard to get to the Springwater to OMSI from the Hand neighborhood, and there's a lot of cyclists in that neighborhood that are trying to get there, and so they've been rattling cages at the city and trying to get grant funding and trying really hard to get that elevated. So maybe you could join forces with Hand and try to get that elevated. Yeah, Todd?
Mia, would that be similar to Earl's Orphan Highway idea?
That's a good idea. Why don't you explain that?
There's been some discussion by Earl Blumenauer and other staff of starting what's kind of an orphan highway approach. You have these older state arterials that, similar to your problem, they need bike and ped enhancements. They're stuck in the 20s and 30s, but the state, it's not high on the state's list, but it's high probably on the city's list, on the neighborhood's list. So potentially a city or jurisdiction would take over that route and perhaps get some additional earmarked funds through state or federal monies. And so that way everyone can win. The state doesn't have to maintain it, and yet the community gets a livable facility.
I was really impressed with the Selwood neighborhood. They just are really impressive with their activists. You should go talk to them about how they got it done, because they got the city to fund various studies, including a study on Tacoma, which has some similar issues. And they eventually got the city to apply for grant funding, and then my firm did the work on the Tacoma Street analysis. And the neighborhood was just simply not going to accept any engineering projections that led to a different conclusion than what they wanted, which was fewer lanes and better crossings and more trees and lighting, and the ability for the Tacoma Street to improve economically. They felt like it can't ever improve economically looking the way that it does today, which is probably an accurate analysis. And I don't really know how they did it in terms of PDOT's the city's current economic crisis, how they got the city to go ahead and spend money on Tacoma. But they did, and it's partly already been implemented. Then they got grant money to do another piece of it, and they are just dogged in their pursuit, really all coming from the Selwood-Moreland SMILE Improvement League. That's it. Kevin Downing, I think he should lead classes in how you get an effective neighborhood group to influence the cities. Kevin Downing at the SMILE Neighborhood Association, and since they're the neighborhood to the south, that might be a good teaming opportunity on that one. Yes.
Yeah, especially in terms of McLaughlin, because
exactly.
It bounds them in too, and they're already looking at rebuilding the Bybee overpass and having lots of problems with that, from what I've heard in meetings this week. So
that's great that you're active in your neighborhood. Yes.
Well, I know the city's looking at changes to transportation on Foster, 82nd to where it meets with Powell. What do you think the feasibility of eventually getting a bike lane on that street
Foster
is?
from 82nd to, I thought there was a bike lane on Foster maybe from 92nd then, huh? There's a bike lane for part of it. Not from 82nd. There's a bike lane that starts at about 92nd where Foster and Woodstock come together, right? So I think it's really hard.
Jennifer, are you talking about from Powell to Lance? Is that
from 52nd to 92nd. That missing piece.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be really hard. It's going to be really hard. It's a trade-off with parking, and I think it's going to be a hard sell to make that case. Because we looked pretty closely at that in the bike master plan and ended up with recognizing that Woodstock and some of the other perpendicular streets were going to have to be the focus. Wait, I had a question back here. Yes.
I was just wondering, since a lot of us are or went to school at the university towns in Oregon or other states, whether there's been a high influence in the city of Portland by people who are trained at those universities and used to, for instance, in Eugene, there's 5 dedicated bike bridges across the Willamette River. I realize it's a narrower river there and there's not any shipping. But is there any thought of putting in dedicated bike bridges in Portland, or are they just so prohibitively expensive?
Well, there is a bike bridge in Portland. It leads from the Columbia Slough Wastewater Treatment Plant over the slough as part of the Peninsula Crossing Trail, and that was the first bike bridge. And there's, yeah, I mean, there's been discussion over the years, and it is extremely expensive to do that. And we've looked hard at with all the various discussions that have been gone on about South-North Light Rail and where you would have crossings, where you would have them, whether we could integrate a bike ped-only bridge as part of that. And, you know, no resolution has ever been made on having a Willamette River crossing for that purpose. So we just haven't gotten there yet. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it'll ever happen or not. I don't know. I mean, the steel bridge in and of itself, it's kind of like having a bike ped bridge, only that it's next to a train. Slow-moving train.
Related to that, then, with the piece that we have now in the Springwater, you know, the two pieces.
And there's going to be 3 bridges on the Springwater Corridor.
Well, that's what I was curious about. I wasn't sure about. I mean, and those are mostly rail crossings, or rail and.
There's a McLaughlin crossing, and there's 2 rail crossings. There's 3 missing bridges. Right now, the Springwater Corridor dead ends in the Eastmoreland neighborhood, and you can literally look down at the tracks right where it ends. And so there's 3 missing bridges, and Metro has that is funded to design and build those. So that's the next piece that'll get funded and built. And it's under design right now. Yeah.
Is anything going to be done to limit the conflict between bikes and pedestrians on the Springwater? Because sometimes the families with the babies, rollers and everything,
Expansive, spread out.
you ring the bell, you're like, ding, ding, ding.
I'll repeat the question. He was wondering about conflicts on multi-use trails, on shared use paths, specifically on Springwater Corridor, between families that spread out on the trail and bicyclists trying to go around families. And I'd say that I don't know what the Parks Bureau or the city is going to do in terms of reducing those conflicts. And it's somewhat of a design issue on a lot of trails. The more popular trails get, the more crowded they get, which makes it harder for speedy cyclists to use those. And what frequently happens is that cyclists that are trying to go speedy choose the alternative route, which is why I would never say that you should just have the path, that instead you should also have bike lanes on the parallel road, because they serve different users. And when the path, which it most likely will get very popular, you have to have an alternative in terms of basic safety for the speedy cyclists that really don't belong on a multi-use environment with the families and everything. They can use the roadway. So I think, you know, what I've learned over the last 10 years is that these facilities all work together, and it's really important to not think of them as an either-or. Yeah.
I guess the example I was thinking of was Stanley Park in BC. Because it loops all the way around the little peninsula there, and you've got on the outside is bicycles only, and the inside lane is rollerblade and walkers.
Yeah.
Actually, I guess rollerblades I think are with the bicycles. I think.
Right, Stanley Park and in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, there's some separation between bicyclists and paths for pedestrians and paths for bicycles. And you know, Springwater Corridor doesn't have the room to do that. But and one of the nice things about Stanley Park too is that they have a lot of money for enforcement, because that's really what it comes down to, is trying to keep people channelized onto those different type of places. But I think that you're right. I mean, a lot of times when designers build paths, they have a limited amount of money, and they're going, okay, well, we should do the minimum. We should make it 8 feet wide, and that'll be enough. And they don't really anticipate that it's going to happen, that what you say is going to happen, that it's going to become so crowded that, gosh, we wish that we had 20 feet, so that we could put a line or separate those users from a safety perspective. And I think lots of places are kind of learning that lesson now, that they should have thought for the best, not sort of thought for the present. They should really have thought for the future. Todd?
Question. Can you also speak to another system of bike lanes that you have? It's the skate routes. And if you have bike lanes that are used by skaters quite a bit, should you design a wider lane, you know, like a 5-foot minimum based on their cadence?
In bike lanes, you mean, on street? Well, I think they should, minimum wider than 5 feet?
Yeah.
I don't know. we didn't really get into the skate issue that much when I worked at the city, and I haven't really dealt with it that much in terms of the skate issue, and whether I think that it's more appropriate for them to be on the street than on the sidewalk. But I don't think that having it be wider than 5 feet is generally a good idea in locations, because then it starts to look like a parking lane, and you start to confuse people with parking. So I don't know. I don't know what the right answer is. I think we have to have more. Perhaps you should work on that. Yes. Over here.
I just have a question. Has there been any initiative to develop a system like MapQuest or like TriMate system where you can just put in you want to go to, say, wherever, and what's the best way to go by bike? Where's bicycle lanes?
A web-based system.
Mm-hmm.
The yes, I know some places that are doing it right now. Los Angeles is working on that. Los Angeles County has a very high-tech firm, and our firm's involved in it, where we're designing a system exactly like that. And you're going to be able to put in some variables. What type of rider are you? Would you like to go on major streets? Would you like to make a transit connection? You know, those kinds of things will be involved. So I think that it'll be spreading in the next few years.
But it's not important.
It's not important yet. Yeah. Yes.
I don't know what your thoughts are on the best methods of bicycle detection at signalized intersections. There's problems with loop detectors recognizing bicycles, and is there video or infrared, or I don't know what technology?
Push button, infrared, video detection, and loop detectors. I think that you can calibrate. I mean, I've seen extremely good success in calibrating loop detectors to recognize bicycles. If it's in a bike lane, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be able to use a loop detector. If it's in a travel lane and you're trying to get bicyclists to position themselves just so, it's more challenging. It's very hard to get cyclists to, you know, even though there's a marking that's used, it's very hard. Cyclists, I think, for the most part, still don't really know what that means. I don't think I've heard of any really widespread and extremely reliable video or infrared detection yet, although I think a lot of cities are experimenting with it and are making progress. Push buttons, you know, have kind of an inherent design flaw in that where do you locate them if the bike lane isn't right against the curb? And if you can, I mean, there's some successful applications where it's right at curbside, and I think it's kind of nice because it's kind of like a resting post. Push the button and rest. And I think it's nice to have it really clear that something will happen because of the issue of bicyclists disobeying the red light, and that if they feel like it's going to take time, you know, most of those are like within a program cycle of 90 seconds or something, so 45 seconds, whatever it is. So you push the button and you might have to wait 43 seconds depending on where it was in the cycle, and it can be a real problem for enforcement or for getting cyclists to obey. If there's a gap, they're just going to go, which I think is a problem. So I think having being able to have more automatic response is good. And I think that having it timed in with other signals is beneficial if you can have timed signals. So I mean, I think there's all kinds of technology out there that's working, and that's going to continue to improve that situation. Allison?
What is Metro's role in the whole regional bikeway system? I mean, we have Portland, which is pretty comprehensive, and then we have Wash County and Clackamas County. Is there someone at Metro besides Bill Barber? I mean, something comprehensive that's tying it all together.
In terms of what they do, besides just having a map, I mean, they have a map,
right.
Which they distribute funding. That's primarily what Metro does, is distribute fund from a bike perspective in the region, is that they allocate regional funds to, they rank them and they allocate regional funds to projects that are on the regional bikeway maps. The other main function that they have from a bike perspective is is acquiring properties for the trail network, and in certain cases actually developing the trails, and in theory, they are interested in even managing some of those trail properties. They don't own any roads. They don't have they have developed their own design guidelines for streets, even though all the jurisdictions have their own design guidelines, and so the role of those design guidelines and how they apply is murky at best for the bike and street design guide world of stuff. I don't know I know for a fact that if the city of Portland's designing their bike lanes, they don't look at Metro's street design guidebook to see what they should do. I mean, they have their own design guidebook. So in some things, Metro's sort of an extra layer, and in some things, in terms of the regional funding, they're pretty key and crucial. Yeah.
Just regarding the loop detectors, for those of you that don't know, a lot of intersections when you come up, you have to get out of your pedals to do it, but if you literally put your bike down on the street, you'll activate the loop detector.
Okay, but we can do better than that, actually. Can I draw on this thing? Okay. This working? Got paper? Loops either look like this, or like this, or sometimes they look like this in Portland. There's other loops in other places. This is what they look like in Portland. John, do you have any other loop types in Vancouver?
Yes, we have a line down the center of that square loop. Yeah. Yep, right straight down.
That's what the loop looks like? Yeah. Okay, so when you come up to the intersection, he's saying you would lay your bike down on this flat. You don't have to do that. You just need to position yourself to break the magnetic current in this spot, basically in two spots, in here, or you could stand here, or you could stand here. And that's where the little markings are generally positioned. So you don't have to, but don't stand right in the middle. And usually you can see the lines in the pavement, and so this is where you want to stand, is right here. And you need to stand there and not get off the loop in most cases, because if you get off the loop, it depends on the intersection, but it might send a signal that says that that car has turned right and drop the call. Okay, good. Okay, thank you all for coming.
I'm Shayna, and I'm in the MERT program right now.
And you're at the BTA?
I'm not at the BTA, but I'm probably going to be working with Tom Mose at the BTA, who's their AmeriCorps. He's one of their AmeriCorps staff right now.
Great.
And hopefully doing a Safe Routes Spirited project with Tubman.
Good. Good.
And
Good.
so
Great.